We're currently living through the genetic era. This got started in 1953 with Francis Crick and James Watson with their discovery of the double helix shape of DNA. So DNA, as you probably know from high school, is the chemical compound that encodes the encyclopedic set of instructions for producing and maintaining all living things. So the next major breakthrough came with the Human Genome Project. They were able to sequence the human being's 3 billion letters of DNA code. So all of this code is grouped together into 20 to 25,000 genes. And so scientists are, rapidly pioneering genetic factors that cause and contribute to diseases. They're trying to develop tests to identify and predict, even before conception, specific human conditions, and they're researching ways to alter genes to affect cures and treatments, enabling patients to have more control over the genetic makeup of their children. And we're peering into the future of the power of profoundly changing the human genome. So these are going to be intersecting with a lot of the principles and issues that we've been concentrating on. Paternalism, autonomy, beneficence, patients' rights, confidentiality, abortion, killing, personhood, reproductive technology, justice in providing healthcare, research ethics, and even more. Okay, so genetics is a huge topic, and we are only going to scratch the surface. But this is the most notes that I've had for any video so far, so I'm sorry if this ends up being the longest video, even though we're barely getting into anything. But yeah, there's going to be a bunch of ethical questions around genetics. So here's a couple to keep in the back of your mind as you're watching this video today. Should genetic testing be used to identify or predict diseases even when there is no treatment available? Do carriers of a deadly genetic disease that is likely to be passed on to the children have a duty to warn those children of the risk? Who should control genetic information about a person, and what is a physician's duty regarding truth-telling and confidentiality? Is it playing God to alter someone else's genes to treat a disease or prevent them in the future generations? Is it wrong for a parent to use preconception, genetic testing, and embryo selection to avoid having a baby with disabilities? Do these practices discriminate against disabled people? Should genetic technology be used to select children on gender or other attributes such as eye color or musical or athletic abilities? Should eugenics be employed? We're going to touch on what eugenics are, but yeah, this is, should genetic information be applied to whole populations in an attempt to improve the human genome? So again, I want this to be like an active note-taking activity. I want you to be thinking about these questions as we are going through this chapter. So a little disclaimer, I am not a biology teacher, I am not a chemistry teacher, I am a philosophy teacher, so I am probably going to get some of this biology or biochemistry wrong in some way. I'm sorry, but yeah, we just need to have at least the basics down so that way we can understand the ethics of genetics and genetic codes and all that stuff. So first, the cells are the fundamental building blocks of all living things. DNA is the code that directs the cell's construction, development, and operation. So all living things from ants to elephants have DNA made up of the same chemical compounds, and it has the same molecular structure, the double helix. So these two strands, there's going to be two parallel strands that are linked together by crossbars that are going to work together in a spiral staircase looking thing. So the crossbars are going to be formed with matching pairs. These are known as base pairs. So the base pairs are given 4 letters. So A for adenine, G for guanine, C for cytosine, and T for thymine. So the these 4 letters are gonna make up the entire genetic code. And when the code is read, it helps produce various proteins that provide the material for the building blocks of the cell. So an organism's complete DNA is known as their genome. The human genome has 3 million base pairs. So it does not read all 3 billion letters as one long word, rather it breaks them up into chunks known as genes. So these genes are the fundamental units of biological inheritance. So the human genome contains about 20 to 25,000 different genes, and the length of each gene can vary from a few hundred base pairs to 2 million base pairs. Each gene has a duplicate, one inherited from the male parent, one inherited from the female parent. In the cell's nucleus, the genes bundled together into 46 string-like molecules known as chromosomes. So these bundles are arranged into 23 pairs, 22 of the pairs being the same for the male and the female. The 23rd is the sex chromosome. So on that 23rd chromosome, males have an XY and females have an XX. So all of this working together is going to bring about a living organism. For us, it's going to bring about human beings. To be clear, genes have a say, but they definitely don't have the final say in how a person turns out. There are other things, such as environmental factors, that can impact this. So when all of this works, when all of the DNA is working together and it's all correct, the organism is going to thrive. But there's going to be mistakes in the code, and when there are mistakes in the code, it can cause disease or disabilities. So these mistakes are known as mutations or alterations. And that's when there's a mistake in the DNA sequence. It could be as simple as a single letter being added, deleted, or just the wrong letter. But then it could also be something like an extra gene or an extra chromosome or is added, or something that's essential is left out. So genetic mutations can be acquired through the environment. This is things like exposure to radiation or noxious chemicals, or things known as carcinogens. Carcinogen is literally Latin for causing cancer. Carcinogen is cigarette smoke. So these can also be inherited through genetic diseases, can be transmitted through families. Genetic errors are responsible for about 4,000 hereditary diseases, or at least I guess those are the ones we know about so far. Although we've made a lot of progress in this area, the exact connection between genes and genetic diseases is not simple. Most genetic diseases are not caused by a single gene mutation, but rather a mutation in multiple genes, often coupled with environmental factors. So it can get very, very complicated. So thanks to the Human Genome Project, it's now possible for us to check genetic diseases by just checking a person's DNA. This is known as genetic testing. Now we have the ability to test for about 2,000 of those diseases. And genetic tests are done for several reasons. So first we have newborn screening. We test newborns for diseases that we have an early treatment for. So every state mandates at least some newborn screening. Some screen for as many as 30 genetic diseases. This started when we discovered a disorder known as PKU. This is a disorder that results in mental retardation if it's not treated with a special diet. Next we have carrier testing. A carrier is someone who only has one copy of the mutated gene and will not get the disease, but if 2 carriers together have a child, then that child will inherit the mutated gene. And it will increase or it could possibly just increase the likelihood of the child getting the disease. So these are diseases like PKU, cystic fibrosis, sickle cell disease, and Tay-Sachs. So predictive testing. These are tests done before any symptoms start appearing to determine whether a person may develop a genetic disease later in life. These are recommended for people who have a family history. These tests can predict with varying degrees of certainty that a person will develop the disease. So it partly depends on how much we know about the disease, what we know about the genes linked to the diseases and whatnot. So for instance, Huntington's we know quite a bit about. So when we test for it, we know there's 100% certainty that someone would have it. But another disease, in contrast, thrombosis, a blood clotting disorder, where if you have one mutated gene, you're going to have a slightly higher likelihood than the general population to develop thrombosis. So genetic testing, this is pretty straightforward. This is to confirm or rule out a diagnosis of someone with symptoms. So the difference between diagnostic and predictive testing is the appearance of symptoms. Next we have prenatal screening. These are tests done to determine if the fetus has any genetic abnormalities and would likely cause physical or mental impairments. These are done when there is reason to suspect something might be a higher risk, something like the mother's age or genetic history. If there's bad news, then the parents really only have one decision, either to follow through with the pregnancy or to have an abortion. So it gets more ethically complicated there. Next we have pre-implantation genetic diagnoses. This is a test done on a fertilized embryo in vitro to screen for genetic abnormalities. So in each cycle of IVF, in vitro fertilization, several embryos are produced, but they only use the genetic tests to select for embryos without genetic mutations and then implant those ones into the woman's uterus. So again, at this point, the cell is only about 5 or 8 cells, so they're going to remove 1 or 2. So that's nuts to think about how many cells they have to remove. This kind of testing is costly and usually reserved for cases where there is a high risk of disorder, e.g. Down syndrome or Tay-Sachs. So these tests have limited usefulness. At best, they give us probabilities of developing a disease, but they're not going to give us certainty in a lot of them. We can identify gene mutations, but it's not clear what the implications are going to be. So, for example, we can accurately determine if a woman has the mutation in her BRCA1 or BRCA2 gene, and this will tell us not that she is surely to develop breast cancer, but that she has a greater than 80% chance of doing so by the age of 70. So that doesn't really tell us whether she's going to, die of cancer. That doesn't tell us whether she's even going to have a struggle with cancer. Living to 70 is a pretty awesome thing, and then even then, she still has a 20% chance of not having it at all. So it's really not clear what the genetic test is telling us there. Or how predictively it can be in the future. So when the test indicates that some mutated genes, that does not guarantee that the patient will develop the disease. So some diseases are caused by a single mutation like Huntington's or Tay-Sachs, but most are caused by several genes interacting and also other things like environmental factors. So not all genes responsible have been identified, so these tests might only be giving us half the picture. And the mutations can occur later in life, so a test early on does not guarantee a disease-free future. So also the intensity or appearance of the symptoms can vary from person to person. The worst part is that our ability to test for these genetic diseases has far outpaced our ability to treat them. As a result, some people think that this knowledge is more of a curse rather than a blessing. So in a 2002 Harris poll found that 81% of adults would likely want genetic tests for a treatable, if there is a disease with a treatment, otherwise, or response to risk reduction. But only 48 would likely have the test done if there is no known treatment or other ways of cutting the risks. So I think this is a super interesting question, and I think this is probably going to be an attendance poll, so definitely think about that one. Would you get a test for a genetic disease if you know there was no treatment? And then also in contrast, would you get the test if you knew there was no treatment? Like, would you get the test just for pure knowledge in a certain sense? So regardless of the results of the test, these can have a huge emotional toll on the patient. So even if you do have the mutation, this can result, it can be reassuring, it can be empowering. But a person might also still feel kind of sad. They might have some sort of survivor's guilt. And they might turn out to be reckless. They might think that, oh, now I'm invincible. So yeah, that can have negative consequences as well. Now, let's say you do have the mutation. Okay, well, I guess one of the positive benefits is that you have the knowledge now. But yeah, you're more likely to feel feelings of anger, depression, or being frightened. You might also think that, the world is fatalistic, that your, future is already predetermined, so you might become reckless in that sense. But then there's other things as well. So you might feel ashamed, guilty, or social stigma. And it can cause even more family conflicts. So beyond just this emotional toll on the individual patient, there are many other ethical concerns around genetic testing that we are going to have to go through. So this is going to be one of our first ethical questions. Should an individual get a genetic test if an incurable disease, genetic disease, is suspected? So suppose you're a young person who has a chance of developing Huntington's, and this is a disease with no known cure and doesn't affect people until middle age. They know that the test will confirm or disconfirm their suspicion. So on the one hand, they might choose to know because they want to confront life's hazards with eyes wide open and to exert as much control as they can over their fortunes. On the other hand, they may forego the chance to learn their fate, seeking instead to live in hope as long as possible without the weight of the terrible diagnosis pressing down on them. So as we saw from that poll, most people are, not going to want to know if there's not a cure to the disease. Okay, so maybe that's your choice, and there's actually a whole arc in House on this. One of the characters, 13, Olivia Wilde's character, she knows that her mom had Huntington's, so she knows that she has a 50% chance of getting it. And there's a whole arc of whether she should or shouldn't get the test, and it's a really interesting bit. So definitely something to check out. But it can get even more complicated. So let's now suppose that this is a 45-year-old mother who is now just presenting with symptoms. If she has it, then her children have a 50% chance of having it. And again, the average onset of symptoms isn't until you're 35 to 44 years old, and death doesn't occur for 13 to 15 years after that. The symptoms slowly progress to extreme cognitive impairment and loss of motor functions. So now the moral question is does she have a moral obligation to get tested? Now, the person who doesn't have any dependents, maybe they don't, but when it's the mother with children and we know that she has symptoms, does that change things? Now, does she have a moral obligation? Should she have to share that information with her children? Or maybe you just think that she should get tested because you think there's just a general, obligation towards knowledge. So some maintain that because the disease is untreatable, that she is not morally obligated to get tested. Others say that she is morally obligated because not warning her children is wrong. They think that this violates our duty to prevent harm to others. If the children are warned, then they can choose to get tested. And if they're positive, they can better avoid transmitting the disease to other generations. So cases of genetic testing are in conflicts with other principles, the principle not to harm others, but then also an individual's autonomy. So let's consider three brothers. Let's just take three famous brothers, the Hemsworth brothers, Chris, Liam, and Luke. Now suppose Chris is diagnosed with Wilson's disease, an inheritable metabolic disorder caused by liver dysfunction, which causes serious psychiatric problems. Wilson's is an autosomal recessive disorder, and since Chris definitely has it, Liam and Luke each possess a 1 in 4 chance of having it as well. So another thing to consider is that effective treatment is possible if they start before the symptoms appear. So we were saying Chris has it, so he obviously has symptoms, so maybe effective treatment couldn't help him, but Liam and Luke have now a 1 in 4 chance, and they are not presenting symptoms, so they can still have effective treatment. Now, no one else in the Hemsworth family is aware of this genetic risk, and Chris knows all of this, but he's ashamed, especially of the psychological symptoms, and he requests privacy and to be respected, and that his diagnosis be kept from his closest relatives. So others argue that on the other hand, the principle of autonomy says that we should respect Chris's autonomy, and that he should be permitted to keep his diagnosis from his siblings. But on the other hand, it seems that he has an ethical obligation to prevent harms to others, in particular, in this situation, his siblings. So which principle is going to outweigh the other? Some say that duty to prevent harm is going to outweigh autonomy. So remember that autonomy is not an absolute right, that it can be overridden. In this case, it's to prevent harm to others. So others are going to say that autonomy is supreme and that we have no obligation to prevent harm. So again, we might have a duty to not cause harm to others, but we don't have a duty to prevent harm from others. We don't have a duty to constantly go around saving everyone all the time. So cases like the Hemsworth brothers are not just an ethical dilemma for the patients, but they are also a dilemma for the clinicians. So doctors are duty bound to keep privacy, but they also have a duty to prevent harm. The law is not clear about this, so some cases suggest that doctors have an obligation to inform their relatives if they are likely to have serious harm. And some physicians have also been sued for informing their relatives. So again, physicians are going to be split on this as well. Some physicians think that breaching confidentiality is morally permissible if there is more harm done in keeping the secret. So that's going to be a utilitarian calculation there. So again, other physicians are going to strictly adhere to the non-disclosure agreements, the HIPAA privacy rules. So either way, they're likely, but so either way, whether they agree with keeping the confidentiality or in preventing harm to others, either way, a physician is likely to encourage the patient to be the one to warn their families. Even if you respect a patient's autonomy, you can still encourage them and pressure them to try and tell others, try and not harm others. So one possible suggestion I was thinking about was, maybe if there is a risk of the genetic test, then, or if there is a risk that, their siblings might have it, then, maybe that's something that you have to talk to them about before you have the test done. Like, hey, look, we're testing for Wilson's. If you're positive, then we know that your siblings are going to have a 1 in 4 chance. So, before they actually even have the genetic test done, telling them about these issues and telling them about warning their family members ahead of time might, prevent these issues. But it might also have an unintended effect of discouraging people from ever getting the test in the first place, which could also cause further harm, maybe to themselves, or if they go on to have children, to, their children as well. So the principle of beneficence and autonomy here are going to intersect, which means that we're going to have to talk about paternalism. Hooray! Whether a doctor tells the patient the results of an untreatable disease, are they revealing results that are really in the patient's best interest? This problem is particularly salient when the results of one genetic test for a patient shows that they're at high risk for another untreatable disease. So, for example, the APOE gene for coronary heart disease shows a higher risk for eventually having Alzheimer's disease as well. But withholding this information is not respecting the patient's autonomy. They should have the right to know about their medical conditions, even if that news is going to be upsetting to them. So maybe we should just restrict the access to these tests. It's kind of what I was saying, where I was saying, we should only give these tests to people who are willing to share this genetic information with the others who are going to harm them. Or maybe we should restrict it in other ways, like physicians, like a prescription. They're the ones who are, having to give out these tests. So some say yes, because the results can be misleading or confusing, and overall just not helpful. Other physicians are going to say yes, because they should be restricted, because sometimes genetic self-knowledge can cause psychological harm, such as depression, anxiety, or panic. Those who think that the patient's autonomy trumps concerns about truth, the potential truth ruining a patient's life, are going to say that no, these tests should not be restricted. So some people are going to be reluctant to get the test because they are concerned about genetic discrimination. The use of genetic information by employers or insurance companies or others to discriminate or stigmatize these people. The fear is that they might not get a job or health coverage if they are found out to have a genetic disease. So in 2008, Congress passed the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. This is going to prohibit genetic discriminations either by insurance companies or employers and barring them from actually requesting a test in the first place. So this is a matter of treating people fairly. Can we really give someone an advantage or a disadvantage based off of their genes? Is it morally permissible to discriminate against someone in this way? Or, because these factors are out of their control, that maybe this is something we shouldn't be allowed to discriminate on? Is it right to discriminate against people who are healthy but now may one day be unhealthy? So that might not make sense to you, but think about it like this. So, training a doctor or training, someone in grad school takes a lot of time and effort and money. It's not easy to train someone. So, why, if you have a person who comes to you in their, mid to late 20s and they know they have Huntington's disease, are you really going to spend 5 to 10 years training this person for them to only be able to use that knowledge and training and expertise for 5 more years? Or are you going to give that slot to someone else who is, fully healthy and able to, treat patients for a long time? So yeah, that would be discriminating against someone who's healthy now but might not be healthy later on in the future. So what diseases or jobs might make sense to discriminate against? Maybe there are some situations where it is okay, where it is appropriate, but other ones where it's not. So think about why, think about justifications for, what makes the moral difference there. Prenatal genetic tests are going to come with the moral conflict of abortions. So these are known as selective abortions. These are abortions done to avoid having an impaired child. Once the genetic defect has been discovered, there really aren't much options. You can either go on to have the child with the impaired child, or you can have an abortion. So those who are against abortions tend to be also against this kind of screening. They're also against, obviously, selective abortions. So they think that there's nothing morally impermissible about giving birth to a child with an impairment. In contrast, most people think that it's wrong to not prevent a devastating disease in a child. But this is a lot more complicated than you think. So the sentiment is something along the lines of the child would be better off without an impairment. So it's wrong not to prevent the impairment. But this idea really isn't super coherent. So Dan Brock explains this pretty well. The difficulty is that it would not be better for the person with the handicap to have prevented it, since that can only be done by preventing him from ever having existed at all. Preventing the handicap would deny the individual a worthwhile, though handicapped, life. If a mother's failing to prevent the handicap would not make the child worse off, then failing to prevent the handicap does not harm the child. And if she does not harm the child by preventing this handicap, then why does she wrong the child morally by failing to do so? So maybe it's wrong for other reasons. Some people might think that it brings down net happiness. Other people think it disregards their interests at a decent chance at a good life. So some people think that they're anti-genetic testing because they think that this is going to be tantamount to discrimination against disabled people. Testing attempts to eradicate a group of people, which is, morally wrong because you're trying to eradicate an entire group of people. This is like eugenics when you're trying to eradicate an entire race. Either way, it's sending a message to people with disabilities, and the message is saying that it would be better off if disabled people did not exist. So bioethicists defend genetic testing that it does not necessarily entail discrimination or disrespect. So we have this quote from Jonathan Glover. Much of what is involved in equality of respect is compatible with screening. Aiming for the conception of the birth of a normal person, for instance, is perfectly compatible with insisting that the rights of disabled people are fully respected and seeing them as equals. Medical treatment presupposes that health is better than sickness, but those who believe in it treat sick people as their equals. So further, the anti-testing stance is going to have an unfavorable conclusion. So, as Jeff McMahon puts it, it's wrong for people to try to avoid to have disabled children, and to have a non-disabled child instead. If it's morally mandatory to allow oneself to have a disabled child rather than to try through screening to have a child who would not be disabled, then it must at least be permissible to cause oneself to have a disabled rather than a non-disabled child. So this is supposed to be counterintuitive. It's supposed to be wrong to choose to bring a disabled child into existence instead of a non-disabled child. So I guess maybe if we are deciding between these two, in vitro fertilized embryos, and one has a higher chance of a disability than the other one, then it seems like, yeah, maybe in that instance we should be, preferring the embryo or selecting the embryo that has the lower chance of disease, or, thinking about it the positive way, the higher likelihood of a flourishing life. But again, maybe that's not always the case. Maybe there's a mother who really, really wants to have a child, and she was lucky to conceive the one that she did have, and then she found out that it had a genetic disease. And it's like, okay, should she, abort this child because it's wrong to bring a disabled child into the world? And it's like, no, that doesn't seem to be the case. So there does seem to be a middle ground here between these two. So there's some other things we need to be considering here. What about the likelihood of the disease? So again, not all genetic diseases are going to have the same likelihood. So we have some with certainty. So Huntington's, we can know with 100% certainty whether someone will develop this. So that might seem justifiable, but what about other diseases that have lower likelihood, like dyslexia or deafness or things like that? What about the intensity of the side effects? So does it matter whether it's a struggle to read or whether it's a struggle to breathe? Maybe some of these disabilities or the symptoms of the diseases can justify or will really ruin someone's life, which then would justify having this genetic screening. So what about when the symptoms appear? So can they live a somewhat fulfilling life before they're actually going to experience the debilitating disease? Some predicted disorders can be mild or treatable. Would patients have an obligation to screen out embryos with such disabilities? Would it be permissible for the parents to screen themselves? So think about this, what is a disability is kind of vague. As I was saying, I have a learning disability, but I think I am living a pretty fulfilling life. But then there's also deafness. So a lot of people think that this is more of a clear disability that people will have, but there are deaf communities all around the world. There's one in Nantucket where there's a small island, and I want to say 80% of the people on the island knew sign language and were very respectful of deaf people and the deaf culture. So if someone in that island had a child, then it seems like, okay, yeah, they might have, it might be morally permissible for them to choose a deaf child, which might seem crazy or counterintuitive to someone outside of this community, but someone inside that community would understand that having this impairment is a sign of inclusion and something that helps you feel a part of a community. So now that we know the code of life and we can identify some of the mistakes, of course now we want to be able to treat it and repair it. This is known as gene therapy or genetic engineering. This is the manipulation of someone's genetic material to prevent a disease. So you can do this in one of three ways. You can replace a missing or defective gene with a normal one. You can repair a faulty gene so it will function properly. You can also activate or deactivate a gene. This is switching it on or off. So delivering the gene into the cell is the tricky part, but we figured out that we can do it using carriers, these viral vectors. So naturally, viruses seek out particular cells and try and transfer part of their DNA into them. Scientists then can redesign these viruses, deactivating their harmful characteristics and having them carry strands of DNA to the targeted cells. This modifies the DNA cell, which introduces the production of proteins that cause normal functioning of the cell. So a really good example of this approach is the treatment of hemophilia A and B. So this is a disorder that puts people at risk of bleeding to death because of an impaired blood clotting factor. The problem is caused by a mutation in the genes that manufacture the proteins necessary for clotting, called the blood clotting factors, resulting in deficiencies in the proteins. So in both animals and humans, scientists have used viruses to transfer normal copies of the genes into the cells, enabling the genes to start producing the blood clotting factors. So these therapies have been working in animals, and they're starting to show promise in humans. So there are two types of gene therapy. We have somatic cell therapy and we have germline therapy. So somatic cell therapy is going to be altering the genes in a person's somatic cells. So these are going to be regular body cells, something like your liver cells, your heart cells, your muscle cells, all of that. And this is going to be to treat an existing disorder. This is going to be something that is just going to help this patient. It's not going to be heritable to their offspring. In contrast, the germline therapy is the modification of the genes in germline cells. So these are going to be egg cells, sperm cells, or a zygote. So these genes or these alterations are going to be inherited to the next generation after them. So most research right now is currently on the somatic cell side. The germ cell side is very, very divisive and controversial. Some people see it as a dream of eradicating genetic diseases. Other people see it as a nightmare of designer babies or an irreversible harm done to the human genome. Now, designer babies is a kind of interesting topic, but it's really kind of impractical now, and I don't know, unless everyone really is going to want the exact same designer baby, I'm not quite sure that there's going to be ever, a lack of genetic diversity. Now, I think the problem would be if Walmart comes in and offers specific genetic design babies, and it's like, okay, if Walmart's only saying we have 4 kinds of babies and that leads to only 4 personality types in the entire world, then it's yeah, that's a huge problem. But we have such a diversity of preferences that when we are designing our children, we're also going to design different children. We're going to want different things. But yeah, so other people think that designer babies is a huge controversy. We just don't have enough time to talk about it. It's not practical right now, so let's focus on the practical concerns. So yeah, the germline cell therapy is seen as the potential here to cure these genetic diseases is so great that we just can't stop researching. We're going to have to do it. So we're going to have to proceed here with caution in a certain sense. But yeah, still there are also going to be some limitations here. So accurately delivering the genes to the nucleus in the cell, but also then safely controlling the viruses. But then also the complexity of disorders with multiple genes here at play. So some experimental therapies are being researched, but none of them are available for the public yet right now. But most people agree that gene therapies could possibly be available in the next few years, if not within the next decade. It definitely seems extremely possible. So to look back, we've come a very long way. In the 90s, we started having some promising cases of genetic splicing that was actually working, but for the most part it really wasn't working. Those therapies were causing reactions in the immune system from the viral vectors, or the genetic splicing was imprecise and it would cause cancer in the patients that it was trying to cure. So they didn't have the precision back then. They were trying to splice things in, but it would honestly just go random, and that random mutation might then be what caused the cancer to grow and metastasize. The moral permissibility of gene therapy revolves around a cost-benefit analysis. Just like any other kind of therapy, there's going to be side effects, there's going to be intended effects, and we need to do a cost-benefit analysis of that. Currently, somatic therapies are under tight regulation and strict oversight to ensure an acceptable balance of the potential risks and gains. Currently, the prevailing view is that if such steps are taken to minimize the harm and the potential risks are substantial, or the potential benefits are substantial, then somatic cell therapy is morally permissible. In contrast, germline therapy are morally impermissible. The main problem is that we don't really know the ramifications of editing the germline yet. Editing the germline might prevent the diseases that we're trying to, but it also might cause something worse. And then if we're editing the germline and we cause something worse, that could also then be passed down to their children. And even worse than that, it could get into the entire population and irreparably alter the human genome. Now, it doesn't mean that we should necessarily renounce this research, but rather it's more that we should proceed with extreme caution. So now here's some points in favor of gene therapy. So if it's within our power to correct flaws and thereby prevent or cure diseases, aren't we obligated to do so? If the therapies offer us a chance to prevent harm to future people, don't we have a duty to try? So this one's a little bit tricky. Some people don't think that we have an obligation to future people because they don't exist yet. So how can we have an obligation to something that doesn't exist? If the principle of autonomy or reproductive liberty grants us the freedom to reproduce or not reproduce, does it also give us the right to choose whether to decide to have an offspring with a disability or a disease? So I mean, yeah, just like if we have reproductive freedom here, we have the right to choose this stuff, then do we also have the right to choose this stuff? So if you have the right to choose an abortion, then do you also have the right to choose to edit your children? So those against gene therapy tend to respond that reproductive freedom has its limits and germline therapy is over the line. Specifically, the manipulation and destruction of embryos in the process of germline therapy shows disrespect for human life. So germline therapy disrespects and discriminates against people of disabilities. That's just another point that people are going to say against germline therapy, just against gene therapy in general. So gene therapy strikes some as sounding like the eugenics movement. Eugenics is the deliberate attempt to improve the genetic makeup of humans by manipulating reproduction. So a lot of people think of the Nazis' drive for racial purity when they hear about eugenics, but really they were inspired by the US eugenics program where we forcibly sterilize criminals and imbeciles and defective persons. So eugenics is problematic for many reasons. Most notably, it violates individuals' autonomy. These actions were coercive by the state, but eugenics is also a broad term and it doesn't necessarily have to always be coercive actions by the state. So you have negative eugenics. This is the prevention or treatment of a disease typically through genetic testing, embryo selection, selective abortions, or germline therapy. So then there's also positive eugenics. This is said to include attempts to improve on normal functions. Theoretically, through germline therapy, parents could produce children who are smarter, taller, or more resilient to certain diseases than normal children. So this is thought to be controversial even though it's not practical yet. We can't edit for height or intelligence or athletic ability yet. Now we might be able to someday, but we can't yet. And as I was saying, because this is impractical, we're just gonna set this part aside. So just in terms of eugenics, some people think that this positive-negative distinction is going to make a morally relevant difference. Some people think that negative eugenics, we have a moral obligation to do that. So we have an obligation to prevent diseases. But positive eugenics is just flat out wrong. So some bioethicists don't think that there's a distinction here. John Harris says, suppose that we isolate a gene coding for repair enzymes which repair damage from radiation or other environmental pollutants. But this would also prolong healthy life expectancy. Since it would enhance life expectancy, would it really be morally impermissible to give this out to people? Would it really be wrong to let people suffer because the cure is too good? There is, in short, no moral difference between attempts to cure dysfunctions and attempts to enhance function when enhancements protect life or health. So others still think that there is a moral difference between the two. Gene therapy is morally permissible if it's intended to ensure or restore normal functioning, but it's impermissible if it's aimed at enhancing functioning beyond normal functioning. So genetic enhancements would lead to another more flagrant kind of social injustice. It would give some people a competitive advantage over others with certain things like beauty or sociability or intelligence. This is unfair because some people can afford it while others cannot. The nature of these goods, it's also specifically unfair because the nature of these goods are such that the benefits could possibly be limitless. Like, I don't know, like how much can you get a limited amount of muscle? But so there are over 200 kinds of cells in the human body. We have muscle cells, blood cells, skin cells, nerve cells, and so on. All of these types can arise from one type of cell present in the early embryo. These cells are undifferentiated and they have no specialized function. But they can later become differentiated and turn into any cell that the body needs. Under normal conditions, they quickly turn into the various cell types that the body needs to develop. But we've also learned how to take them out of the embryo and keep them in this undifferentiated state, then cultivate them in these petri discs. At this point, they're known as embryonic stem cells. So there are also adult stem cells, but these are constantly renewing and repairing parts of the body. But adult stem cells are limited to the types of cells that they can turn into, unlike embryonic stem cells, which can turn into any type of cell. So stem cell research shows that stem cells can be used to treat certain diseases that are caused by lack of functioning cell types. So these are diseases like Parkinson's, diabetes, heart disease, Alzheimer's, stroke, spinal cord injuries, burns, and arthritis. And these are potential right now, but now we have effective treatments for blood and skin transplants. And this potential is what's really helping to continue drive research in these other areas as well. The moral controversy is over the source of embryonic stem cells. In retrieving the stem cells, the embryos are destroyed. So the embryos that are used in stem cell research are the byproducts of IVF, in vitro fertilization. These are going to be the embryos that were not selected for implantation. Otherwise, they were selectively aborted. Alternatively, the scientists in the labs, they can create a blastocyst specifically for research, which is, just to create a test tube baby and then take the stem cells out. But the stem cells can also be harvested from a fetus that has been obtained from an elective abortion. So it's impractical so far, but they're also looking into creating embryonic stem cells from cloning. This is different than reproductive cloning, but the method is still the same. So they're going to take a stem cell and they're going to replace the nucleus of an egg cell with an ordinary somatic cell from an adult, and then simulate the growth and cellular division. In research cloning, they would harvest the stem cell derived from a blastocyst, while in reproductive cloning, they would put the blastocyst in the implanted woman's uterus. They would implant the blastocyst in the woman's uterus, yeah. So a huge advantage of this approach is that the stem cells would generally genetically match the donor's body, and so there would be less risk of tissue rejection. So yeah, that's a huge advantage. This approach is only experimental though, but it's been showing promising results in animal experiments. So there's a long controversial history of stem cell research in the law. In 1995, Congress passed a law banning the use of federal funds for research involving the destruction of human embryos. In 2001, George Bush declared that no federal funds will be used to obtain new stem cells by destroying embryos. In 2009, though, Obama issued an executive order that overturned Bush's restrictions, allowing federal funds to support the responsible and scientifically worthy human research of stem cells. In 2007, though, there was a major breakthrough. Skin cells could be reprogrammed to take on the characteristics of embryonic stem cells. Many thought that this would resolve the ethical dilemmas of sourcing stem cells, but we still don't really know much about these new forms of stem cells, and so currently research is pursuing both paths until one is clearly favored. Okay, so the core question is it morally permissible to destroy a human embryo in search for a cure? Those who are against abortions because they think that an embryo has the same moral status as a person are going to think that this is morally impermissible. Others who think that destroying the embryo disrespects human life by reducing it to a commodity, I could see that completely. I mean, if we're literally growing these embryos in a lab and then selling them to people, how is that not a commodity? But yeah, so generally people who think that an embryo has the same rights as a person cannot justify the potential medical risks or scientific benefits. The potential medical or scientific benefits. No risks. Further, using or benefiting from these stem cells is also impermissible. So not only just like researching on them, but actually getting the treatment would be impermissible. So someone who thinks that this is wrong also would think that it's wrong maybe to get the treatment from this. So those on the other end of the spectrum are going to maintain that a blastocyst does not have the same moral status as a person. They don't have the same moral rights. Rather, they can treat it any way that they would treat any other human cells. Yeah, so like your skin cells, your brain cells, the way they treat anything like that. So they're going to say that it's morally permissible to use these stem cells, especially if it has a promise of alleviating so much human suffering. So there is also a middle ground here, of course, there should be. So embryos have less than a full moral status, but they deserve some respect. So there's this really good quote here from Bonnie Steinbach. Lacking the kinds of ends that persons have, embryos cannot be given the respect that is due persons. Nonetheless, they have a significant and moral value that other bodily tissue do not have because they are potent symbols of human life. So she thinks that we can show respect to an embryo by not using it in frivolous ways, like teaching it in high school biology classes or using it for cosmetic jewelry. But it does not mean that we can't use it for research, especially if that research is likely to have a huge benefit, like curing diseases. There are other ways of approaching a middle ground here. So you could think that mining stem cells from embryos is objectionable, but manipulating already available stem cells is not. Taking stem cells from aborted fetuses or from embryos left over from reproductive IVF is permissible, but using embryos created for research through IVF or therapeutic cloning is wrong. Using IVF embryos created originally for whatever reason is morally permissible, but generating embryos from stem cell extractions through any kind of cloning is immoral. So yeah, a lot of different ways of taking a middle ground there. Now we're going to apply the major ethical theories. First, we're going to start with the utilitarianism approach. This approach would likely favor genetic testing and therapy if it had a benefit for the general welfare. Knowing more about the genetic risks and benefits must be weighed against the harms of misleading test results, genetic discrimination, and breaches of doctor-patient confidentiality. So on this view, prenatal testing and pre-implantation genetic diagnoses, or PGD, are morally acceptable because they prevent diseases and disable children, as well as the emotional and economic burdens for the families and society. The utilitarian approach would also not make a distinction between somatic and germline cells. Both are morally permissible or impermissible. It's just going to depend on the risks versus the benefits. They would also a utilitarian would likely endorse positive eugenics, again, if the benefits outweigh the risks. And they'd be fine with the source of embryonic stem cells from any source, as long as there's a net benefit to society. According to natural law theory, forms of genetic testing are going to be permissible to gain knowledge about health risks and guide treatment. But they are against prenatal or PGD because this usually leads to selective abortions, and that would be a clear violation of the unborn's right to life. The somatic cell therapy is permissible because it aims, just like any other therapy, to have therapeutic ends. In contrast, germline therapy as a tool for positive eugenics would be wrong because this is contrary to nature. I'm also not quite sure what they would say about for negative eugenics, if that's contrary to nature, but that's an interesting twist. But yeah, so then further research using stem cells derived from embryos are considered morally impermissible. So yes, this is also treatments as well here, according to natural law theory. So if you fully believe in this natural law theory, then and you had a genetic disease and the only treatment was stem cells, you would have to say, no, I don't want that treatment. So yeah, that's one consequence there. So according to Kantian deontology, individuals' autonomy supports their right to know or not know the results of the genetic test. This also protects their individual privacy, and the results should remain confidential. Generally, on a deontology picture, everyone should be treated fairly, and no one should face any kind of form of genetic discrimination. If an embryo is a person, so this is a huge thing on Kant, it's not clear whether he thinks an embryo is a person, and a lot hangs on that. So if an embryo is a person, then destroying it after genetic testing would be impermissible, which then means that maybe doing the tests would be impermissible, because, you know, the selective abortion is really the only option then. If it could be argued, though, that destroying an embryo person can be justified on the grounds that it prevents further suffering, and this might actually be more respectful of personhood. It might also be argued that the positive eugenics is a way of improving human life without disrespecting personhood, without obliterating it in a certain sense. All right, so we've covered a lot today, so let's recap all the things we've been talking about. So first, just DNA is the genetic code that tells cells how to grow, function, and divide. Genes are the basic units of biological inheritance. Genes are organized into 46 chromosomes, arranged into 23 pairs. A mistake somewhere in this code can cause a disease or a disability. We looked at genetic testing. This looks at flaws in a person's DNA. There's a bunch of different kinds of genetic testing. We had newborn screening, carrier, predictive, diagnostic, prenatal, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, or PGD. But testing is limited. It can only deliver certain answers, and it can only give us percentages about developing a disease. The biggest problem here is that we can test for way more diseases than we currently have treatment for. The moral concerns here are about information shared. First, if the patient even wants to know, but then if they are positive for the disease, are they obligated then to tell their family members? And it's not just an obligation for them. Are physicians then obligated to be confidential, or are they obligated to tell their family members? So then we looked at gene therapies. There's two kinds of gene therapies. We have somatic cell gene therapy and germline gene therapy. Somatic cell is the alteration of genes in a person in their somatic cells, so there's cells in their body. Germline cells, the alteration of genes in an egg, sperm, or a zygote. The ethical concerns here are the medical risks and benefits, the duty to prevent harm, the reproductive freedoms, and the practice of eugenics. So yeah, a whole bunch going on there. So then we have embryonic stem cells can be derived from, these are derived from blastocysts, aborted fetuses, research cloning, or genetically engineered somatic cells. The ethical issue is whether it's morally permissible to destroy the embryos in search of a cure. Those who think that a fetus is a person are going to say no. Others might reject this view, thinking that the stem cells are morally permissible, allowed for research. And again, there were a lot of middle grounds in between there. Okay, so this one was for sure the longest one ever, but that's because I haven't recorded the CRISPR one yet, so we'll see how that goes. But again, I'm not a geneticist. I don't know, I'm not a doctor, so again, I don't know if I said any of this correct. I was just trying my best. Yeah. Oh man, can you see the umbrella the whole time? Oh, bummer.